When last we journeyed into the Westlands, exploring the history of the world of the Wheel of Time, our story ended with the breaking, as male channelers spread chaos across the globe, heralding the end to the Second Age, the Age of Legends. Slowly, the world began to pick itself back up and rebuild. What followed was a true Dark Age in the classical sense. So much of the knowledge and learned individuals that had once created a worldwide utopia were gone. The age, called the Third Age by some, would be marked by nearly constant strife and war, and would not reach the glorious heights of the land's past for thousands of years, possibly ever, at least until the wheel's turning once again reaches the Second Age. All across the land, various peoples migrated to safer pastures. The Aiel, once the peaceful Dashane, trekked eastward, crossing the spine of the world and settling in the waste. Those who escaped the breaking via ship settled on many islands surrounding the Westlands, slowly forming their own identity as the Sea Folk. The distant land of Shara would eventually unify, while the continent that would later become the seat of the Shanchan Empire fell into endless battles against the Shadow. The many centuries that made up this Third Age of mankind has fittingly been split into three eras by historians. AB, after the breaking, in which the long and bloody Trolloc Wars were waged. FY, the Free Years, when Arthur Hawkwing rose to glory and conquered the Westlands. And NE, the New Era, when the nations familiar to readers were forged, leading to the events of the books. Now, since the documentation for these years is much more thorough, since, no apocalypse erased the knowledge from the world, covering every little detail down to the smallest border wars to the raising of every Amerlin would be boring for both you and I. So for this video, we're only going to cover the most important events, and those that connect to the books, going chronologically. Before beginning though, most of my information is coming from the Wheel of Time companion books, though I also extensively used the timeline on the wiki, as well as an absolutely incredible blog called The Wertzone by Adam Whitehead. He has an incredibly detailed series of blog posts charting this entire history that proved invaluable. I've left a link in the description if you want to check it out, as it's far more detailed than this video can be. Early after the breaking, the surviving female Aes Sedai began to consolidate power, ostensibly to gain back some of what was lost in the tumult. In 47 AB, a conference was held, led by Elaine Tishar, in which the sisters decided to form a single organization to be centered on the island of Tarvalin. However, not all of the women present were satisfied with the terms of the arrangement. In particular, Ladine Rajan and Mylene Harvole had their own renegade factions. Through the second half of the century, these factions warred with the still under construction White Tower until 77 AB, when Rajan was stilled and Harvole subsequently surrendered. Finally, in 98 AB, Elaine Tishar was raised as the first Amerlin seat of the unified White Tower. One effect of the male channelers' insane rampage in the breaking was, effectively, the creation of new territory. Much of the modern western portion of the continent was underwater during the previous age. To fill the power and land vacuum created by these events, 10 great nations arose from the ashes of the Westlands. There isn't much detail on exactly how or when this came to be, outside a mention of Manetheren as early as 100 AB. Of the nations of Aelgar, Almoren, Coromanda, Eheron, Essenia, Haramide, and Sefer, not much of their early history has survived the unceasing erosion of time. However, we do know a bit more about the others. Aramel, located in what is now the Borderlands, was one of the strongest and most prosperous of these newly founded states. Perhaps it was their proximity to the Blight, or perhaps it was their queen, herself an Aes Sedai. Whatever the reason, they were one of the first to truly organize against the remaining Shadowspawn. Eridhall existed in what is now unclaimed territory north of Andor. Book readers will be very familiar with this once great nation, as its capital is now called Shadar Logoth, the dead city where Matt goes all emo. And of course, there was noble Manetheren, by far the nation with the most extensive surviving record. Just after the breaking, settlers began to move into the newly created Mountains of Mist, discovering a wealth of minerals waiting to be mined. Over time, the settlements that these pioneers built coalesced into a single nation and identity, Manetheren, the mountain home. While nobody living, save for Aes Sedai, could personally remember the glories of the Second Age, stories of its global civilization still lived on. It's perhaps these stories that led the 10 nations to cooperating on a scale not seen again until the last battle. Regardless, by 209 AB, a common need to defend themselves against the Trollocs, Myrddraal, and other Shadowspawn led them to unanimously sign the Compact of 10 Nations. Organized by Mabriam-in-Sharid, Queen of Aramel, and Grey's sister, the Compact bound the nations to one another, requiring the members to send aid to any of their fellows should they come under attack by Shadowspawn, like a fantasy League of Nations. Not only that, but it effectively set up safe, friendly relations between each of the nations, ensuring nearly 800 years of relative peace to follow. Over 100 years later, in 325 AB, the very first false dragon announced himself, Raylan Darksbane. Seemingly, his proclamation and conquest were very short-lived, as he was defeated and gentled by the White Tower Aes Sedai in the same year. The followers he was able to gather vainly smashed themselves against the Shining Walls in an attempt to rescue their leader, but were unsuccessful. They were some of the first, but not the last, to fail in taking the tower. From here, while there are the births of great leaders and translations of important texts to fill in the timeline, we are going to skip ahead to the year 1000 AB, to the Trolloc Wars. It was at this time that Ishamael, first among the Forsaken, began to slip from his confines at the Boar. When Luz Therin crafted his seal with the 100 companions, Ishamael was closest to the entrance, and thus had the weakest restraints on him, allowing him to project his consciousness and even physical form back into the world for periods of time, before fading back into the Boar. So, for the first time since the sealing, Ishamael was free to wreak havoc in the name of Shaitan, the Dark One. He set about his task immediately, consolidating the forces of the Shadow, and even founding the Black Aja to be his moles within the White Tower. Fortunately for humanity, his presence in the Westlands was limited. Depending on the source, each time he escaped, he was present for only 20 to 40 years, much of which was spent in an incorporeal mist form. The invasion started in 1000 AB, the very same year of Ishamael's release, and almost simultaneously in the nations of Yaramide and Aramel, the two closest to the Blight. At first, it was believed to be just another raid, easily repelled like all the others. However, those notions were squashed very quickly when the Trolloc army razed the gold-inspired city of Barcine, putting the world on notice. The Compact of the 10 Nations ensured the Westlands would rally a defense to push back the Shadow's army in the north. Yet, they were ultimately unsuccessful. The army of Trollocs, Myrddraal, and even Dreadlords, both Aes Sedai and Wild Channelers, continued to push further south into Aramel, forcing back the armies of Man and destroying the capital city of Mafal Dadarnel in their fury. Aramel, once a beacon of humanity's resilience, one of the most powerful nations among the Compact, fell to the dark shortly after. Between 1000 and 1200 AB, the Shadowspawn armies forced their way deeper into the Westlands, invading Eredhal and Coromanda, as well as multiple unsuccessful attacks on Tar Valon. At this point, the war was not going well for humanity, to say the least. Not only did they lose one of their member nations, but another was left reeling. These southward pushes often resulted in heavy losses, as the Shadow simply had the edge in numbers, not to mention the individual physical prowess of the Trollocs. Over time, the forces of the Light would develop specialized guerrilla tactics to deal with the enemy. Fighting pitched battles usually meant catastrophe, so they adapted, splitting off smaller forces from the main horde, surrounding them, and then pounding them with arrows or channeling. They would also set traps and ambushes, anything to give the physically smaller, outnumbered humans an edge. Unfortunately, this change in strategy would not come early enough to save everyone from the onslaught. In particular, the nation of Eredhal suffered great losses and faced repeated harassment from the Trollocs. At this point, King Balwin Mael was being advised by Mordeth, a once good man who had gone in search of a power, any power, no matter how malevolent, to wield against the Dark One's forces. He advised King Mael to invoke the strategies of the Shadowspawn against the Shadowspawn, fighting fire with fire. While it's unclear what this meant in specific terms, it's said that the nation's war strategy turned to becoming colder, less caring of the human toll. Their battle cry became, "The victory of light is all," demonstrating their zeal for triumph at any cost. And though the tactic was successful, the cost was indeed steep, resulting in heavy bloodshed on both sides. Ultimately, the populace of Eredhall, in their zeal, turned against itself, even imprisoning and torturing a prince of Manetheren, a supposed ally. When the king of Manetheren heard of this and marched his army to Eredhall's door to exact retribution for the betrayal, they found the city completely uninhabited, consumed by Mashadar, the evil that Mordeth unwittingly created in his machinations. The rampant, festering paranoia and mistrust had morphed into a corporeal presence as a result of the disaster. To this day, the downfall of Eredhall serves as a parable, warning against unrestrained zeal, no matter how noble the cause. Though the exact dates of the events at Eredhall aren't known, it was likely sometime in the mid-1100s. By the end of the 12th century, the nations of Coromanda, Almarin, and even valiant Manetheren would follow Eredhall into collapse. 5 of the once great 10 nations wiped off the map. But I'm getting ahead of myself. In 1155 AB specifically, perhaps the greatest king of his nation and the era was born. Aemon Alcar Althorin, the 2 names after the Als indicating his father Car and grandfather Thorin. In 1175, Aemon became king and wed the most powerful channeler of the age, Eldrine I Ellen I Carlin, who follows a similar naming convention. After their marriage, she bonded him as her warder, and the 2 were said to be as benevolent as is possible for a monarch. It was also said that Aemon was the match for any of the great captains of the modern era in terms of battle strategy. He was a genius in warfare, and under his rule, Manetheren was a beacon for the forces of the light, answering pleas for aid all over the continent. As Moraine said in The Eye of the World,
Aemon, a man so fearless that the greatest compliment for courage any could give, even among his enemies, was to say a man had Aemon's heart.
Eventually, word of Aemon's noble deeds and prowess in battle spread, and men from all over the Westlands came in droves to join the banner of Manetheren. Greatest among Aemon's warriors were the Band of the Red Hand, an ancient order that had served as the king's guard since early in Manetheren's creation. The idea of the band was likely inspired by the real-world Irish legend of the Red Branch, which was filled with the greatest warriors of Ireland at the time. Again, Moraine tells us of the band's glory.
Wherever battles raged, the Red Eagle banner of Manetheren was in the forefront. The men of Manetheren were a thorn to the Dark One's foot and a bramble to his hand. Sing of Manetheren, that would never bend knee to the shadow. Sing of Manetheren, the sword that could not be broken.
However, being such a beacon drew the attention of everyone, including the Dreadlords. The leaders among them decided that Manetheren and Aemon himself had to be destroyed to have any chance of lasting victory for the Shadow. And since my own prose would come up short in this tale, we turn back to Moraine to learn of the Mountain Home's demise.
They were far away, the men of Manetheren, on the field of Bekar, called the Field of Blood, when news came that a Trolloc army was moving against their home. Too far to do else but wait to hear of their land's death, for the forces of the Dark One meant to make an end of them, kill the mighty oak by hacking away its roots. Too far to do else but mourn. But they were the men of the Mountain Home. Without hesitation, without thought for the distance they must travel, they marched from the very field of victory, still covered in dust and sweat and blood. Day and night they marched. They moved as if their feet had wings, marching further and faster than friends hoped or enemies feared they could. When the Dark One's armies swooped down upon the lands of Manetheren, the men of the Mountain Home stood before it, with their backs to the Terrandrell. The host that faced the men of Manetheren was enough to daunt the bravest heart. Ravens blackened the sky, Trollocs blackened the land. Trollocs and their human allies. Trollocs and dark friends in tens of thousands, and Dreadlords to command. At night, their cookfires outnumbered the stars, and dawn revealed the banner of Baalzamon at their head. Yet they knew what they must do. Their homeland lay just across the river. They must keep that host, and the power with it, from the Mountain Home. Aemon had sent out messengers. Aid was promised if they could hold for but 3 days at the Terrandrell. Hold for 3 days against odds that should overwhelm them in the first hour. Yet somehow, through bloody assault and desperate defense, they held through an hour, and the second hour, and the third. For 3 days they fought, and though the land became a butcher's yard, no crossing of the Terrandrell did they yield. By the third night, no help had come, and no messengers, and they fought on alone. For 6 days, for 9, and on the 10th day Aemon knew the bitter taste of betrayal. No help was coming, and they could hold the river crossings no more. Aemon crossed the Tarandrel, destroying the bridges behind him, and he sent word throughout his land for the people to flee. The soldiers of Menetherin took up the fight again to buy with their lives what hours they could for their people to escape. From the city of Menetherin, Aldrine organized the flight of her people into the deepest forests and the fastness of the mountains. But some did not flee. First in a trickle, then a river, then a flood, men went, not to safety, but to join the army fighting for their land. Shepherds with bows, and farmers with pitchforks, and woodsmen with axes. Women went too, shouldering what weapons they could find and marching side by side with their men. No one made that journey who did not know they would never return. But it was their land. It had been their fathers', and it would be their children's, and they went to pay the price of it. Not a step of ground was given up until it was soaked in blood, but at the last the army of Menetherin was driven back to here, to this place you now call Emond's Field, and here the Trolloc hordes surrounded them. There could be but one finish. No man or woman who had stood beneath the banner of the Red Eagle at that day's dawning still lived when night fell. The sword that could not be broken was shattered. In the mountains of mist, alone in the emptied city of Menetherin, Aldrine felt Aemon die, and her heart died with him, and where her heart had been was left only a thirst for vengeance. Driven by grief, she reached out to the true source and hurled the one power at the Trolloc army. In the passing of a breath, the Dreadlords and the generals of the Dark One's host burst into flame. Fire consumed their bodies, and terror consumed their just victorious army. The final vengeance came more slowly, but it came when they were hunted down by other peoples, by other armies in other lands. None were left alive of those who did murder at Aemon's Field. But the price was high for Menetherin. Aldrine had drawn to herself more of the one power than any human could ever hope to wield unaided. As the enemy generals died, so did she die, and the fires that consumed her consumed the empty city of Menetherin, even the stones of it, down to the living rock of the mountains. Yet the people had been saved. Nothing was left of their farms, their villages, or their great city. Some would say there was nothing left for them, nothing but to flee to other lands, where they could begin anew. They did not say so. They had paid such a price in blood and hope for their land as had never been paid before, and now they were bound to that soil by ties stronger than steel. Other wars would rack them in years to come, until at last their corner of the world was forgotten, and at last they had forgotten wars and the ways of war. Never again did Menetherin rise. Its soaring spires and splashing fountains became as a dream that slowly faded from the minds of its people. But they and their children and their children's children held the land that was theirs. They held it when the long centuries had washed the why of it from their memories. They held it until, today, there is you. Weep for Menetherin. Weep for what is lost forever.
The field on which the Battle of the Tarandrel was fought was later renamed to Aemon's Field, in honor of their once great king. It is said that upon the spot of Aemon's death, an aquifer sprang from nothing, the spring's water flowing unceasingly ever since. Later, through cultural and linguistic drift, the field was renamed to Aemon's Field, and the spring became the wine spring of the two rivers, after which the Alvir's Inn was named. In fact, there are quite a few cultural artifacts that remain all these centuries later, including surname conventions, as in Rand Althor and Egwene Alvir. The fallout from Menetherin's demise was far and wide, even causing the Amerlin seat herself to be deposed for the first time ever. Tetsuan was an Aes Sedai of the Red Aja before being raised to the seat in 1200 and then stilled in the same year. She was the one who had promised Menetherin aid in their darkest hour, and she was the one that betrayed them. It is said that she was jealous of Eldrine's power, which is understandable if petty, and her beauty, which slides uncomfortably into r/men writing women territory. Regardless, because of her envy, she not only withheld aid from the tower, but also impeded the other nations of the compact from sending their own aid. After her stilling, Tetsuan was sent to work in the kitchens and died 3 years later. Her story is a cautionary tale to this day and an embarrassment for the Sisters of the Tower. With little resistance to stop their rampage, the Shadow's armies were able to press on and eventually sack Iharan on the southernmost coast, which contained the Ogier-built cities that would later be named Ilion and Ebu Dar, the latter of which suffered a terrible fate when the Shadow Spawn descended. Iharan was spared total annihilation, but just barely. However, all hope was not lost. In 1251, Rashima Karenmosa was raised from the Green Aja to the Amerlin seat, gaining the moniker the Soldier Amerlin, after her tendency to directly manage battles, often from the front lines, as opposed to the previous women to hold the seat who often deferred to warders or generals. Nearly 40 years later, she led the defense of Tar Valon in the fourth and final Shadowspawn attack. Despite the heavy damage incurred to the city and its civilians, the Sisters of the Tower and its defenders were able to repel the Trollocs. This event seemingly inspired a second wind in Karenmosa. She followed it up with an absolute clinic on effective diplomacy and warfare that saw victory after victory for the forces of the light in the decade that followed. In 1301, she led the charge at the decisive Battle of Maigande. If you're American, think of the Battle of Yorktown. The climax, yet not the true end of the war. Unfortunately, though the forces of light were victorious, Rashima perished in battle along with her 5 warders. It's said that walls of Trollocs, Murdral, and no small number of dreadlords surrounded their bodies. The cleanup of the remaining Trollocs in the Westland, those that either fled or weren't at the battle at all, would last for decades. However, the Shadowspawn army was thoroughly broken by the defeat. What followed was a time of relative peace, a nearly mythical state not seen in several generations. Or it would have been, except the Dark One got the last laugh. The year prior, a second false dragon proclaimed himself, Urien Stonebow. The timing couldn't have been worse. He quickly amassed followers and marched to the Stone of Tyr in the then nation of Assinia. Ultimately, he was repelled and even captured by the combined might of the remaining nation's armies. However, doing so expended a great number of resources and took attention away from the scattered Trollocs. The few that remained in the Westlands were never again able to rally an army like what was seen during the height of the war. Yet they still harried small villages and indiscriminately raided towns and homesteads across the subcontinent before finally being wiped out decades later. With the Trolloc Wars won, humanity entered the second era of the Third Age, what would later be called the Free Years. The change in dating formats wasn't some commemoration of the war, though that would be the publicly accepted reason. It was born of pure necessity. The wars had caused such destruction and confusion that the exact date was no longer known. Unfortunately for the Westlands, it wouldn't be the last time that this happened.
Foreshadowing.
Despite the name The Free Years, not all was well in Randland. The wars took a heavy toll. Of the once 10 mighty nations that originally signed the compact, 5 were destroyed directly by the Trolloc armies, their peoples scattered and disorganized, likely becoming refugees in nearby nations. Of those that remained, Yaramide, Iharan, Assinia, Saphir, and Aelgar, the fallout was delayed, but it was no less exacting. Industry, manpower, infrastructure, anything and everything that makes a nation was depleted. Because of this, villages and cities far from the capitals began to break away into their own fiefdoms, small enough for them to effectively protect themselves. Soon enough, the fragmentation was complete, and not one of the original 10 nations remained. Slowly, over the course of a century, the ashes of the 10 gave birth to 29 smaller, less ambitious kingdoms. At that point, over 1,000 years since the breaking, the mythical age of legends was just that, a myth. Anybody able to remember those glorious days, even the near-deathless Aes Sedai, had long since passed. While those 10 nations had voluntarily unified for the greater good, these states were less inclined to do so. The continent was growing ever more segregated. I'm not going to sit here and recite the names of all 29 nations like I did with the 10, partially because damn, that's too many, but also because unlike the titanic legacy of their predecessors, these nations did little to distinguish themselves. Regardless, as time passed, the blight emanating from the boar at Shale Ghul quietly crept ever southward. In free year 291, one of the first victims of its inevitable march was Stedding Sengshu. In fact, the corruption had reached far enough south, past the Mountains of Doom, which, I'm sorry, is a terribly cliché name, that the newly created borderland nations erected watchtowers to track its progress and serve as early warnings against incursions. This self-imposed duty of being the bulwark against the shadow would become part of the cultural identity for these nations and their descendants. After barely surviving the breaking of the world and, much more recently, the 300-year-long Trolloc Wars, the newly created nations of the world were understandably nervous about whatever the shadow had planned next. Because of that, they each built up large standing armies in preparation to protect themselves. Little did they know that the ultimate orchestrator of the last war, Ishamael, would be sealed away in the Bore for another 600 years. And so, all was quiet on the northern front. But armies don't do well sitting idly, and since they had no common enemy, they wound up being wielded against each other, neighbor against neighbor. While this isn't a strange concept in our world, at the time it was a monumental shift. For thousands of years during the Second Age and another 1,000 after the breaking, human-on-human warfare was virtually unheard of, with the exception of defectors to the shadow. In the early centuries of the Free Years, a few of the nations even attempted to seize control of parts of the Aiel Waste. Predictably, they were thoroughly trounced by the Aiel, who seemed content to live in utter isolation. Speaking of the Aiel, while we do know a fair bit of their journey from Paradisen to the Wastes, an exact timeline of their activities in the Third Age is seemingly non-existent, or at least something we're not privy to as readers. However, following from the last video, the division in their ideology grew ever wider. The newer, larger sect would eventually become the fierce warriors we know today. The remainder, called the Jin Aiel, meaning true dedicated in the old tongue, as they still followed the way of the leaf, broke away at some point to found the city of Roidion. This would have been fairly soon after the breaking, in the previous era, when the Aiel first entered the Wastes. The city was actually constructed pre-breaking, but was never inhabited. After, it was meant to serve as both a home to the Aiel and a safe cache of all the relics of the One Power they had secreted away. However, these aspirations weren't viable, as the Jin Aiel were too few in number. As we discussed in the last video, many had split off to become the Tuatha'an, and later the Lost Aiel. Despite that, the Jin still took their charge to found Roidion seriously. Instead of its intended purpose, within the city they crafted, or maybe just set up, it's unclear, a large Turon Grial, the glass columns, which would be used to choose new clan chiefs and wise ones. At some point between 400 and 600 AB, before completely dwindling out, they brought all of the lost Aiel clans together to sign the Treaty of Roidion, in which they agreed to this purpose, and only this purpose for their holy city. I know the Aiel story is a bit out of order here, but that's what happens when your people are isolationist and don't interact with the rest of the world. Back in the Westlands, the Aes Sedai of the White Tower had gained a lot of public goodwill and admiration after their role in pushing back the Trollocs and saving humanity. They gained even more by once again capturing and gentling the third false dragon, Davian, in Free Year 351. However, it may have been a one step forward, two steps back situation, at least for the rulers of the world when they were put on notice in Free Year 450. Princess Sulmara of Masinashar, a newly raised Aes Sedai, returned to her home to take up the throne, all without permission of the tower. She insulted her sisters even further by refusing their counsel and a summons from the Amerlin. That's a big no-no. The tower did not take it well, declaring her a rogue Aes Sedai and sending sisters to take her from her throne back to the tower. There, she was forced to work as a stable hand for the rest of her life as punishment. While this example kept the other nations from crossing the tower in the short term, it also bought them no goodwill from the other monarchs, who disliked walking on eggshells in deference to the sisters. This would become relevant later in the era. We next skip ahead 450-odd years, past the invasion of Chiyoda, past the Great Fire of Tarvalon, to Free Year 912, to the birth of Artur Pandrag Tenrial, the strongest Taviran since Luz Theron himself. Readers will be intimately familiar with Artur Hawkwing's character, as even over 1,000 years later, his story is still legendary. The once and future king was born in the relatively small and weak kingdom of Shandala, located in the region called Cairhien in modern times. Likely the only reason Shandala survived is that, despite having a smaller army than the surrounding countries, it was filled with expertly trained professional soldiers. So although its neighbors were constantly bearing down on the beleaguered Shandala, it was able to keep its sovereignty, one of the many similarities that Arthur's story shares with Alexander the Great. Arthur himself was similarly trained, having dedicated tutors to teach him in the art of combat and warfare tactics. He clearly had a great mind for learning these, as he was considered a master of the two by the age of 20. So he was prepared in 939 at the age of 27, when major events thrust him not only into the throne, but also an obligation to halt the advance of yet another false dragon. The first was the Black Fever, which had spread from far off Shara through the Aiel Waste and into the Westlands by free year 937. Seemingly via traveling merchants. It's a clear parallel to the Black Death of medieval Europe, and just like that real-world disease, it decimated the population and sent the subcontinent into panic. Among its victims were Arthur Peandrag's parents, leaving him as the heir to the Shandalan throne. The second event was Gwer Amalasan's declaration to be the Dragon Reborn, the fourth false dragon in the age. Parallel to Hawkwing's story is Gwer's. He was similarly clever, but where Hawkwing was adept with blade and army, Gwer was a savant at reading individuals and populations. He was said to have been a very charismatic speaker with extensive knowledge of the prophecies of the dragon. He was also capable of channeling the One Power. Thus, when he declared himself and began recruiting people to his banner, he sold the idea well. People flocked to him in such numbers that when the White Tower sent multiple armies from other nations after them, all were defeated. In fact, they barely slowed his march. It seemed that the fall of the Stone of Tyr was a foregone conclusion. Except there was one army that didn't immediately get swept up in Amalasan's tidal wave, the small army of Shandala, led by Hawkwing himself. His moniker came from this period when the two armies routinely clashed, as he was able to swiftly attack and perform tactical retreats at exactly the right moment, just when the numerically superior army seemed on the verge of victory. And it was in this manner that the tiny Shandalan army harried the dragon's forces, becoming a pain in Amalasan's proverbial ass. Finally, at the Battle of Jolvain Pass in free year 943, Hawkwing cemented his status as a military genius when he actually defeated an army over twice the size of his own and captured the false dragon himself. The battle initially seemed to have been won by Amalasan. However, Hawkwing feigned retreat and instead split his force into three prongs, one attacking from the rear and the other two on the flanks, while Hawkwing himself led a charge of Aes Sedai and cavalry to capture the dragon. Though his men were already tired from a day's fighting and marching, it was both their superior training and Hawkwing's own brilliance that allowed them to pull off the maneuver. From the battle, Hawkwing's army escorted Amalasan to Tarvalin and the Sisters of the Aes Sedai to be gentled. However, Hawkwing didn't receive the warm welcome he'd expected. The Amerlin, Bonwyn, was none too pleased to have a foreign army on her doorstep without permission. The standoff between the two didn't last long, however, as there were actually two whole armies under the dragon's banner still engaged in fighting elsewhere. And when they found out about Amalasan, they too marched on the White Tower, with a combined 100,000 soldiers. Despite heavy losses and brutal street-to-street combat within the city, Hawkwing and the Tower forces prevailed yet again. Still, Hawkwing left on bad terms with the Amerlin.
More foreshadowing!
Amalasan was by far the most successful false dragon to that point, having conquered several nations under his banner, on the verge of entering the Stone of Tyr itself in only 3 years' time. And so, when he was captured, it left a power vacuum. Many nations would become embroiled in civil war as the remaining followers of the dragon fought against loyalists to the previous rulers. Now, history is written by the victors, so take this next part with a slight grain of salt. Apparently, the dragon's forces were no longer chanting the name of Amalasan, but Hawkwing himself. As he had defeated their own hero, then surely he must have been greater and deserving to rule the continent. Initially, it seemed as though Hawkwing wanted nothing of the sort, though he later relented. This seems to have angered Bonwyn even further, as she then persuaded armies from the countries surrounding Shandala to attack, claiming that he was a would-be tyrant and that he was secretly fueling the fires of civil war, prepping the continent for his takeover. See, it's not that he wanted to conquer the Westlands. Bonwin came after him. He was being coerced into it. Now, whether you believe that he was completely innocent and that he reluctantly conquered the Westlands because he saw the chaos left behind in Amalasan's wake, or that it was his plan all along, is for you to decide. Regardless, conquer he did. In what would later be called the Consolidation, he, consolidated territories. He first took the nations of Tova, Cambarin, and Kodamar, which the Amerlin had sent against him, and then the ones who sent reinforcements for those nations, each inevitably falling to his armies in turn. It took just over 19 years to bring all the nations of the Westlands under Hawkwing's banner, a lightning-quick pace considering the numerous forces set against the great general. However, his Taviran nature and tactical expertise ensured his eventual victory. Perhaps even more important than that was how well he treated his troops and the nations he conquered, making his army leadership meritocratic rather than based around nobility. It made the newly conquered armies want to fight for him, which bolstered his numbers as he went. Thus, as his enemies dwindled, his own forces grew. And so, by free year 963, the entire subcontinent, save for the Blight and the Aiel Waste, had been unified under the great Arthur Hawkwing, now claiming the title of High King. Hawkwing's story is a clear allusion to the story of King Arthur, given his name and his benevolent ruling tendencies. However, as mentioned, it also parallels the story of Alexander the Great, conquering all of Europe starting with a small, highly trained army and a tactical genius. And he accomplished all of it while still in the prime of his life. Just like Alexander, Hawkwing was not satisfied with stopping at the Westlands. He envisioned an entire world under one government, just like the Age of Legends, and he strove for that. It would be his downfall. Before he accepted the surrender of Aldashar, the final holdout, Hawkwing lost much of his family. First, his son Modair fell in battle, and then his wife and children were covertly poisoned in free year 961. This sent him into a rage, and the Westlands into a period called the Dark Years, where Hawkwing's rule was less than benevolent. 3 years later, in free year 964, he sent his armies into the Aiel Waste, and was initially successful, but ultimately wasn't prepared for the harsh climate or the skilled and furious warriors of the Aiel. It took only a few months for him to realize his folly and retreat his forces back across the spine, ending the 20-year-long conquest of the Westlands in earnest. Thus began the peaceful years of Hawkwing's empire, lasting over a decade. Unfortunately for the world, like everything else, the empire too would end. You see, it had been nearly 1,000 years since Ishamael's first return to the Westlands, and his presence had begun seeping out into the real world yet again. In 973, he arrived at Hawkwing's court under the name Jalwyn Morad, and very quickly became his closest advisor. Within a year's time, Morad had already managed to prey on Hawkwing's enmity towards the Sisters of the White Tower, convincing the High King to dismiss all Aes Sedai from their positions in the Empire, and only a year after that, lay siege to the island city itself. It was a sharp about-face for the Emperor, as he himself had placed Aes Sedai in positions of authority all across the Empire, and even left Tarvalin as a sovereign city-state outside the Empire's governance. The reasoning behind this drastic reversal isn't known, though it's been speculated that Morad drew a straight line from his family's deaths back to the Aes Sedai. Of course, there's no evidence that any sister was involved. While his armies never took the tower, Hawkwing occupied the land surrounding the city, and they would not leave the region for over 20 years. Elsewhere, the Shadow finally made a move after 1,000 years of utter silence in free year 986. Interesting that it should happen while Ishamael was trying to remilitarize Hawkwing, but I'm sure that's just a coincidence. Although it's also interesting that the force sent to bear down on the Empire was, while massive in its own right, much smaller than anything seen in the Trolloc Wars. Another interesting thing is that they skipped right over the borderlands, instead centering right onto the capital and Hawkwing himself. The High King's forces seemingly had little trouble in dispatching the Shadowspawn armies, needing less than a year to claim victory at the Field of Taladar in 987. It's almost like they were used as a prod to get Hawkwing back into conquering? Almost. After the victory and the subsequent natural death of his wife, Arthur Hawkwing seemed reinvigorated for conquest. probably because of the victory and not the death. He first drew up plans to make a new capital dead center in the Westlands, in the Caroline Grass, but more importantly, he began planning great expeditions to lands unknown. He was inspired by the sea folks' tales of islands across the Arth Ocean, as well as merchant gossip about the strange lands of Shara to the east. In the past, as part of his empire-building efforts, he had bargained with the sea folk to gain some of their vast knowledge on shipbuilding and sailing, and used this to build massive fleets on the western and southern coasts of the continent. Thus it was in 992 and 993 that two fleets of over 300,000 men and women on over 2,000 ships left the Westlands. The first fleet was led by Hawkwing's son, Luther, who would cross the Arth Ocean and eventually conquer the Shanshan continent. We'll get back to them in a moment. The second fleet was led by his daughter, her name lost to history. Unfortunately, this fleet would not meet the same success as her brother. Though the details of their fate are unclear, it seems that they had underestimated the Sharans, both in terms of their naval and channeling capabilities. Remember that these fleets likely wouldn't have had any channelers of their own, as the Empire was still at odds with the White Tower. The only record of their failure comes from the sea folk, who tell of a burning fleet consumed by the sea. Luther's fleet at first met similarly ferocious opposition by the Shanshan natives. They used creatures in battle, the likes of which had never been seen in the Westlands, likely the Grom, Roque, and others that we see in the books. He named this foe the Army of the Night, as he believed them to be led by rogue Aes Sedai working in unison with Shadowspawn, though that notion would later be disproven. Eventually, however, a mysterious figure named Diane appeared and gifted Luther a most foul creation, the aeddub. Book readers, and now show watchers, are very well aware of this device's capabilities and the horrors it allows people to inflict on one another. It's likely the main reason that Luther was able to conquer the continent at all, as the nations inhabiting it were mostly led by channelers, not even bound by the Three Oaths, and so could openly use the One Power in battle. It's not known whether Diane was an agent of the Shadow or simply just a woman with high ambitions and no moral compass. Regardless, her ascension would be short-lived, as she was later made into a demone. Luther's war of conquest would rage on long after his death, taking over 500 years to envelop the continent and squash every trace of rebellion. Really puts the 19 years that his father took to conquer the Westlands into perspective. Even after that, the Empire focused on annexing small holdouts on islands and remote areas, before finally turning its eyes back towards the Westlands in the modern era. The story of Shanshan somewhat mirrors that of the Byzantine Empire and their split from Rome, as well as their later reconquest of old imperial provinces. Back in Tar Valon in 992, the Amyrlin, Bonwin, was deposed. Evidence was uncovered by the Hall that she had been manipulating Hawkwing for years, ultimately being one of the reasons the Empire had turned on the sisters. Unfortunately for Hawkwing, however, his vindication would not last for long. By free year 994, his last remaining children had either died or disappeared from the histories, and the High King himself soon followed them to the grave, leaving no heir behind. He died believing that Luther had perished in Shanshan, and that there was nobody left to uphold his titanic legacy. Whew, okay, that was a lot of time spent on one dude, even if said dude was very important. Predictably, after Hawkwing's death, the Empire immediately began to crumble, as his Deviran nature was the glue holding it together. Ultimately, the death of Artur Paindrag Tenreal was just as consequential for the Westlands as his life and conquest was, if not more so. The time of chaotic restructuring and conflict that followed would later become known as the 100 Years' War. In the same year as Hawkwing's death, General Soran Maravale, who had been leading the siege of Tar Valon, broke off and declared herself as the queen of the once imperial province now called Andor. Soon after, the nations of Tyr and Cairhien declared their sovereignty, and the borderland provinces followed suit. Nations we are familiar with: Kandor, Saldea, Arafel, Shinar, and Malkier. Within 20 years, borders had been redrawn all over the Westlands, and we started to see new nations form with, again, familiar names, such as Mayin, Terabon, and Amadisia, in 1004, 1006, and 1023 respectively, as well as others which no longer exist. All across the subcontinent, rulers of these newly established kingdoms vied for control over the scraps of the dead empire. For example, in free year 1063, 4 rival kingdoms joined together to attack a young Andor, which was more like a city-state at the time, at the Battle of the Four Kings. However, the Queen's forces were able to overwhelm the other armies, which would lead to a period of rapid expansion for Andor, ending around 1100, when its borders were more or less the same as they are in modern times. In fact, the place of that decisive battle is the same as the Four Kings village that Rand and Mat visit in the first book. As another result of the prolonged conflict, a fanatic religion called the Children of the Light was formed by Lothair Mantelar in 1021. Dedicated to rooting out people they perceived to be dark friends, including Aes Sedai. By the next century, the religion had evolved into a militaristic organization, doling out their own brand of justice wherever and however they saw fit. Many rulers of these newly founded countries had dreams of re-establishing the empire that Hawkwing had forged, which ultimately led to many of the conflicts throughout the centuries. However, very few came anywhere close to success, the nearest being when Amerlin Diane successfully negotiated with 12 rulers across the Westlands to accept the White Tower as the ultimate authority. Unfortunately for her, she died before finalizing the agreement by, get this, falling off her horse. The creator surely has a sense of humor. The 100 Years' War didn't really have a definite ending. It just sort of petered out between free year 1110 and 1117. The last major conflict being the attempted conquest of Ilion by Narasam Buran, who had found success in Altara and Murundi. However, he too was thwarted, and the Ilioners put his head on a pike as an example to any other would-be conquerors. From that point, the rulers of the Westlands seemingly lost the appetite for expansion, let alone reconsolidation, instead tending to hold their borders as they were. One of the major reasons for this was there simply weren't enough people left to continue warfare at such a scale. A significant portion of the Westlands population had been killed either directly or indirectly from a century-long series of conflicts and governmental instability, which had itself followed the conquest of an empire, which itself followed a false dragon's ravaging. Horrifyingly, it seems that this was Ishamael's goal all along. Destabilize the empire by either sending away or possibly killing off Hawkwing's heirs to leave no clear succession, and going into conflict with the Aes Sedai. While the sisters had their faults, they were also pillars of wisdom and stability in the region. After that, the power-hungry nobility did the rest of the work themselves. It was a much more effective strategy than the Trolloc Wars, as the population wouldn't ever fully recover in the era, continuing to decrease up to the modern day. It was so bad, in fact, that large swaths of the Westlands would later be abandoned completely and lay unclaimed by any nation, because to occupy them would be to spread the populace too thin. By free year 1135, the Westlands were in such disarray that it was uncertain if it was actually 1135 at all. And so, once again, a new calendar was established, leading us to the final era of the Third Age. The biggest question anyone faces when discussing the new era of the Third Age is why? Why did the population never recover to pre-war levels? The Trolloc Wars caused even greater destruction, at least in terms of human cost, yet it was not long before the Westlands were once again teeming with humanity. Yet, in the space of more than a millennia between the last major battle of the 100 Years' War to the end of the Third Age, the population actually decreased, as exemplified in this passage from Lord of Chaos.
Borders and names were enough to rank the maps by age. On the oldest, Harden bordered Cairhien to the north. Then Harden was gone, and Cairhien's border swept halfway to Shinar before creeping back, as it became clear the Sun Throne simply could not hold on to that much land. Meadow stood between Tyr and Ilion. Then Meadow was gone, and Tyr and Ilion's borders met on the plains of Meadow, slowly falling back for the same reasons as Cairhien's. Caroline vanished, and Almouth, Massara, and Erenville, and others, sometimes absorbed by other nations, most often eventually becoming unclaimed land and wilderness. Those maps told a story of fading, since Hawkwing's empire crumbled. of humanity in slow retreat.
The cause is certainly mysterious. There were no major conflicts, at least not large or numerous enough to hinder the repopulation. There wasn't a pandemic like the Black Fever in Hawkwing's time. There wasn't a famine, a drought, or any other major event on such a scale that humanity could never recover. Even the Aes Sedai numbers dwindled, though there is a possible explanation to that with regards to the culling of male channelers. But even that is somewhat questionable, given the mystical nature of the channeling ability. So, again, why? Well, spoiler, I don't have any definitive answer to this question, as there really isn't one given in the text. However, we can draw our own conclusions. I've seen explanations ranging from the high urbanization of the Westlands leading to higher mortality, to the discovery of heartleaf tea as a contraceptive. Yet, while these might have hindered repopulation, none of them struck me as being completely correct, and they still really don't explain the root cause anyway. Why did the population become so concentrated? Why would an unprecedentedly large number of women decide not to have children? I mean, it's not like the real-world corollary, where, in general, countries that have higher education and equity among the populace tend to have lower birth rates. Neither of those are ever shown to be true of the common people in the books. In fact, the oppressive feudal nobility in many countries keep the populace in relative squalor and ignorance. No, I think the most likely answer is the shadow. In general, unless there are huge extenuating circumstances, human populations always trend upwards. That there's no visible natural explanation seems to indicate an unnatural one. Ever since Luz Theron first sealed the bore, the world was on a ticking clock for the seals to break. Worse yet, as the seals weakened, the Dark One's influence over the world grew. In the books, we saw the more dramatic late-stage effects of this in weather pattern changes and the like, but it had been happening quietly for a long time prior. In Knife of Dreams, Elaine says of Min's viewing,
"Her babes were safe, at least until they were born. So many babies died in their first year. Min had said nothing beyond them being born healthy."
So it seems as though there's something that was affecting the infant mortality rate for no apparent or at least given explanation. Again, we can only assume the Dark One's influence, since it seems unlikely that Robert Jordan would have left a mundane explanation unstated. Regardless of the reason, though, human civilization was in decline. 24 nations survived the 100 Years' War. Of those, 10 would collapse by the end of the 6th century. In those years, political intrigue gained a stronger foothold in the Westlands as Deus de Mar, the game of houses, and warfare became fairly commonplace, just on much smaller scales. After the treatment of the Aes Sedai and the institution of the White Tower towards the end of Hawkwing's empire, the public approval of their machinations shifted. With fewer Aes Sedai around, sisters were placed where they would be most effective, at the ears of rulers, meaning they would become a rarer sight for commoners than they were in eras past. This sowed seeds of distrust and fear, and eventually hate. In multiple nations like Amadisia and Tyr, channeling was expressly against the law, and elsewhere, save for the borderlands, it was certainly frowned upon. In 306 NE, during a civil war in Altara, the Children of the Light managed to kill the Amerlin, Serena Latar, and hang her body. It was an event unheard of in the age, the culmination of Ishamael's long play to get the sisters off their pedestal in the eyes of the populace. It would set the two organizations against one another for the rest of the age. Later, around 920, upon invitation from the king in Amadisia, the White Cloaks made a permanent base within the city of Amador. In short order, the children had complete effective control of the kingdom, keeping the king as a puppet, but not before the indignity of moving his palace outside the city. In 500 NE, the first or second, depending on the count, succession war in Andor occurred after the queen's death, dividing the houses over 3 claimants. That same year, or thereabouts, the nations of Goaban, Carolane, and Meadow disappeared from existence, the latter leaving Farmatting as the only functional settlement. In 509, we got another peep out of the Aiel. Somehow, the tribes learned that the Cairhienin were the descendants of the people who, eras before, gave the traveling Dashane the gift of water, saving their caravan. In recognition of this good deed, the people of the dragon gifted the Cairhienins with a sapling cut from the great tree of life, of Indesora, which I incorrectly stated was located in the Eye of the World in the last video. It is in fact located in Roideon. The sapling was a peace offering, something unheard of with any of the other Wetlander nations. As a result of this unprecedented offering of free passage of merchants through the wastes into Shara, the nation of Cairhien grew fat and rich on the trade. In 600 NE, yet another nation collapsed into nothingness. Almoth had begun fading in the centuries prior. What this meant exactly, as with the other nations, is unclear outside a slow degradation of both the populace, which seems to have moved elsewhere, and the governmental body. Since that time, the towns and cities were slowly abandoned, leaving nothing but small, unincorporated villages behind, outside the port city of Falma, though it's unclear if that was even part of Almoth to begin with. But virtually ever since its fall, the Almoth Plains had been contested by the nations of Terabon and Aradoman, which border on the south and north respectively. Yet neither seems to have made a concerted effort in colonizing or otherwise occupying the area. If it seems like I've just been listing main events so far in this era, yeah, that's because I basically have been. Unlike the previous eras, there really isn't a prevailing narrative, at least not until the last few years of the age. Things were just more messy in the new era. Momentous events gave way to slow, quiet degradation. It reminds me of the famous quote from the noted incel poet T.S. Eliot.
"This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but with a whimper."
Humanity, under the constant pressure of the shadow, had started to give, started to buckle. However, it was really only visible to those with a 20,000-foot perspective, like the Aes Sedai or other historians. So yes, things continued to happen. The Aiel were engaged in a 200-year blood feud between clans. There was a conspiracy to unseat the Amerlin, the winter war between Andor and Cairhien. Yet, I'm going to skip past all this to just before the books to move things along. We pick things back up in the 950s. In 955 NE, the nation of Malkir, long a beacon of light in the borderlands, fell due to a combination of a shadow spawn invasion from the ever-encroaching Blight, coupled with a petty power grab. The king's brother, Lan Mandragoran, not to be confused with Lan Mandragoran, was challenged by his wife, Bain, to charge the Blight with a large force of Malkir's lancers. She believed him to be the better of the two brothers, and had aspirations for the crown, if not for herself, then for her son, Isam. The result was an utter disaster, as neither Lan nor his force were ever heard from again. Bain, then alone in the court, decided to take action herself and stage a coup on King Alakir. Her advisor, Cohen Gemalin, himself a dark friend, had a hand in the plot. He was able to gain enough supporters to make a serious attempt on the king's life. However, doing so left many of the crucial watchtowers unmanned and ripe for a Trolloc invasion, which is exactly what happened. Fortunately, Bain's scheme did not work as intended. In fact, she was killed in the invasion, apparently along with her son, Isam, though book readers might have something to say on that. Here is where the legend of Jane Choen, later called Jane Farstrider, first began. He was a Malkieri scout, loyal to the king, and had managed to both capture Cohen and take him back to the Malkieri capital, as well as warning Alakir of the imminent invasion. The king defeated the Dark Friend in single combat, and rallied his forces to mount a doomed last stand against the Trollocs. Before doing so, he sent off his only son, Lan Mandragoran, to safety in Shinar, to one day hopefully revive the nation. 2 years later, in 957, the White Cloaks invaded Altara, led by the young yet crafty Lord Captain of the Light, Pedron Niall. It isn't exactly clear why the White Cloaks decided to mount their attack, outside their general goal of bringing the light to the world and possibly seeing an easy target in Altara. Regardless, Ilian and Murundi, neither friends of the children, watched with concern as the invasion proved successful. Eventually, they decided to unite and drive back the White Cloaks, afraid of what their forces would be capable of when bolstered by the resources of an annexed Altara. It is here where Tam Althor enters the story. He had left the Two Rivers at 17 in search of an adventure, and wound up in the forces of Ilian as one of the vaunted companions. He proved himself in battle, helping the Ilianers to force the children to withdraw back to Amadisia, signing a treaty to return to the borders of their pre-war state. However, Tam was not finished with his time as a war hero. Later in 970 NE, Tyr and Ilion became embroiled in their own border wars. It's likely during this time, or in the Aiel War, that he was promoted to the rank of second captain, the highest rank a commoner could achieve in the Companions. He even earned a heron-marked blade after being recognized a blade master. Speaking of the Aiel War, in 968, the daughter-heir of Andor, Tigraine, wed the nephew of the king of Cairhien, Tarangail Damodred. It was a purely political marriage, as, by all accounts, Tigraine despised her absentee, abusive husband. In 971, her beloved brother Luke went into the Blight with a Shienaran patrol and never returned, though book readers might have something to say about that. Tigraine was understandably distraught by this, as well as the fact that Tarangail only got worse after the birth of her first child, Galadriel Damodred. I swear, some of these Andoran names sound like stuttering. Anyways, Tigraine ran from her marriage to the Aiel Waste and assimilated into their culture, eventually becoming a spear maiden and, eventually, giving birth to the Dragon Reborn himself. These events rippled outwards, leading to yet another succession war, seeing Morgase Trakand take the throne, inheriting Tarangail as husband and adopting Galad as her own. However, unlike Tigraine, Morgase suffered no fools. She refused to be a doormat for her husband, thus reducing the power and prestige of House Damodred in Andor and abroad. This rippled out further, causing King Laemon of Cairhien to make a ridiculously stupid move. In a show of power, or out of plain pride, the reason is honestly unclear. He cut down Avendor Aldera, the sapling gifted by the Aiel nearly 500 years prior, all to fashion himself a new throne. Word reached the wastes of Laemon's Sin, as it was called, in 976 NE. The Tardad clan chief Janduin, along with his wife Tigraine, renamed as Shael, meaning woman who is dedicated, united the other tribes to invade Cairhien. Their goal was not conquest or loot, but simple justice against Laemon, the tree killer. Nearly 100,000 Aiel warriors crossed Jangai Pass and swiftly began destroying any and all resistance they met. Even when Laemon hired mercenary armies from surrounding countries, they stood no chance, almost immediately crumbling and leaving the city of Cairhien to be burned by the Aiel. The war went exceptionally poorly for the Cairhienin, who were constantly forced to retreat further and further back over the course of the next year or so. It seems as though Laemon knew what the Aiel were after, yet he divulged this to neither his generals or anyone else that we know of. By this point, the fighting had moved past Cairhien, past the plains of Meadow, and even up north into the Carolane grass. The surrounding nations, including Tyr, Ilion, and Andor, were starting to sweat, worried that they would be the Aiel's next target, and thus sent their own troops to bolster Laemon's. Even this had minimal effect, though. Finally, what was left of Laemon's army fled to Tar Valon to take refuge amongst the Aes Sedai, who were themselves concerned of the Aiel's true motives, worrying that they planned to loot and burn the entire Westlands. Thus, the Tower sent out Grey Sisters to every nation on the subcontinent, including ones to Amadisia, who, through intermediaries, negotiated with the White Cloaks to send their own forces. And they did. Everyone did, in fact, save for 4 of the most westerly nations who simply couldn't march to the island city in time for the inevitable battle. It was believed that if this so-called Grand Alliance, numbering 167,000 troops, including Tam al'Thor, could pitch a large battle using the shining walls of Tar Valon for defense, that they could rout the Aiel in one fell swoop and force them back across the spine. Yet despite their numerical superiority and their fortified position, the fighting was not easy. Overall, the battle lasted barely over 3 days in late 978. Laemon had demanded the right to lead the armies, to which the leaders of the world unanimously replied,
"How about no?"
After his own disastrous campaign, probably a good decision. However, even then, the Alliance wasn't able to come to a consensus on the ultimate field commander either, instead rotating generals in and out. This disorganization, coupled with the ferocity of the Aiel, made for terrible losses for the Wetlanders, to the point that the battle on the second day would become known as the Blood Snow. On that day, the Aiel managed to find Laemon's camp and nearly wiped out his entire force, executing the tree killer himself. From that point, they seemed only interested in regrouping and retreating back towards the wastes, with Layman's head as a trophy of their victory. Indeed, though the Grand Alliance's harrying cavalry took the retreat as a sign of victory against the Aiel, that was clearly not the case. Slowly, many of the Aes Sedai and world leaders realized this, and that the Aiel were only ever after Layman, and had they wanted more, the Westlands surely would have fallen. It was during the Blood Snow, on the slopes of Dragonmount north of the city, that fighting commenced between some of the Illianer companions and spear maidens of the Aiel. After the battle, while examining the dead, Tam al'Thor found an infant, still held by his dead mother, Shael. From here, I'll let the Creathon cycle speak the final words of our story. The shadow shall rise across the world and darken every land, even to the smallest corner, and there shall be neither light nor safety. And he who shall be born of the dawn, born of the maiden, according to prophecy, he shall stretch forth his hands to cast the shadow, and the world shall scream in the pain of salvation. Yet one shall be born to face the shadow, born once more, as he was born before, and shall be born again, time without end. And there will be wailing and gnashing of teeth at his rebirth. In sackcloth and ashes shall he clothe the people, and he shall break the world again by his coming, tearing apart all ties that bind. On the slopes of Dragonmount shall he be born, born of a maiden wedded to no man. He will be of the ancient blood, and raised by the old blood. When the winds of Tarmangaiden scour the earth, he will face the shadow and bring forth light again in the world. For he shall come like the breaking dawn, and shatter the world again with his coming, and make it anew. Friends, while there are still some events that occur after this, they are all covered within the books. So this is where our journey ends. Unlike the age that preceded it, the Third Age saw constant bloody strife, whether instigated by the Shadow or inflicted by humanity all on its own. Valiant attempts were made by whole nations and individuals alike to return back to the glory of the Age of Legends, but each time, tragedy struck. Ultimately, that's what the Third Age was, a tragedy unfolding at a glacier's pace, a car crash in slow motion. Yet all was not lost, as we know from the books. This is not the end of the tale, for there are neither beginnings nor endings to the turning of the Wheel of Time, but it was an ending. Thank you all so much for supporting the original video. I hope you liked this one just as much. Sorry again for the delay in its production. If you enjoy stuff like this, or any of my other videos, please consider becoming a patron like these fine folks. You can find a link at the end or in the description. And please consider hitting that like and subscribe button. Anyways, I'll see you in the next one. A special thank you to Phoenix Ant the Man, The Jester, Darius, and Spicy Curves for becoming my latest patrons. Thank you guys so much. You rock.